So do you now manage subsidized housing, or would you consider managing subsidized housing? And by subsidized, simply mean government-supported housing. Think of HUD and what they do with Section 8. So a tenant comes to your office and says, will you take a Section 8 voucher? Will you take a housing voucher? Meaning it allows the government to pay a portion of the tenant's rent should you as the property manager choose to enter into this concept of having a tenant subsidized by the government. Not a right or wrong, but there's some things to consider before you decide to work with that particular tenant in their subsidized aspect. It could be subsidized by the state, but often it's subsidized by HUD, federal government, through things like Section 8 housing vouchers. So here's pro number one, the most straightforward, is the rent is guaranteed by the government. The odds of the government defaulting, all jokes aside, on the tenant's rent are pretty low, right? The tenant may not pay all of their rent, but the government is paying a portion of their rent for them. Now keep in mind, typically with HUD, with housing and Section 8, the government is not paying 100% of the tenant's rent. They're going to pay anywhere from 30, 50%, up to 70% of the tenant's rent each month. The tenant is then responsible for the balance of that rent payment. And if the tenant doesn't pay, it does make it a little bit trickier for you as the landlord to go after the tenant, to evict the tenant for that amount, because you have to deal with the government. You're under their umbrella of management services as well. But you do get a higher percentage of guaranteed rent in that instance. A second benefit is less vacancy. It is difficult for tenants to get into the Section 8 HUD subsidized program. So once they're in, they don't want to leave. They don't want to move, which is a good thing for landlords. If a tenant comes into your property and you agree to take Section 8 or a government subsidized program, that tenant is probably going to stay in place for a longer period of time because they don't want to go through the hassles of moving again, finding another landlord who's going to take their housing program. So the tenant's going to stay in place longer, meaning you have less vacancy, less turnover expense. That's definitely a pro. Now, a third pro that the government will tell you is they pre-qualify their tenants, and they do pre-qualify them to some extent. Now, they probably don't go as deep as you're going to want to go. The government does still allow for you to come in and pre-qualify the applicant through your preset criteria. So you're still going to put them through your application process, but as they come to you, if the government's doing their job, they have in some aspect pre-screened that applicant a little bit to ensure they're going to meet their minimum standards to enter the program. Now, it's not all roses though. There are some cons of working within this umbrella of subsidized housing as well. Number one, inspections. Not just any inspections, government inspections. So what that means is the government's going to come in, whatever entity they're a part of, and they're going to want to do an inspection of your property before the lease is signed. And odds are they're going to find some things on that property inspection that they want you to correct, they want you to repair before they will allow that tenant to come in and live in your property. So things that you may be okay with, that may be okay with per your state, per your criteria, HUD may say, no, we don't like the fact that that this carpet is worn. It needs to be newer carpet. The paint has to be fresher. We can't have that crack in the vinyl. That has to be repaired or replaced. So they're going to have a higher standard than you typically have for your rentals. Not only that one-time upfront inspection, but on an annual basis, they're going to come into your property as well. And they're going to do annual inspections, which is good in one aspect. But the downside of that is almost every time, I can just about promise you, they're going to find things on that annual inspection that they want you as the landlord to correct. Not necessarily the tenant, but you as the landlord have to go in there and correct the things that they want you to do in order to renew the lease for another 12 months. Con number two is your lease terms are superseded. By who? Well, by the government entity. See, the government's going to have a lease as well. HUD is going to have a lease as well. And if the terms of your lease are ever in conflict with the terms of the HUD lease, guess who's going to win? Yeah, I don't even need to say it, do I? HUD. HUD lease supersedes your lease. Now, if all of your terms are cohesive and there's no problems, great. But just keep in mind, if their lease says something like you have to give a 90-day notice before you can have a rent increase, but your lease says you can do it with a 30-day notice, you can have to go by the terms of their lease. So in essence, you have to learn another lease and ensure you're abiding by the terms of their lease agreement through their housing HUD Section 8 provider. Con number three, you get less qualified tenants. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. And we do some subsidized housing. I'm not saying anything bad against those people. They're good people in that program oftentimes, but these are individuals that can't qualify on their own. They don't have the income, or else they wouldn't be needing to go through a subsidized HUD type program. So their credit is typically very, very poor. Their income is typically much lower than the average, or else they wouldn't need this program. So from a qualification standpoint, as it relates to income and as it relates to credit, they're not going to be as highly qualified as some other individuals. So again, not a right or wrong, good people in there, but they're not going to qualify as much that way. And as it relates to this, our philosophy is if your market's hot, you may not need to step into a subsidized program because you have so many people who want to rent from you. But when the market slows, when your rental market and demand slows, then subsidized housing can be a good thing. Now, con number 4, rent control. Now you're saying, wait a minute, there's rent control tied into this? Well, technically there's not, but practically speaking there can be, and here's how. Let's pretend for a moment, as happened to us, we're in the Denver market, the Denver market's hot, and we send out a notice of rent increase. So a tenant is in place, their lease term is up, it's been 12 months, and we would love to renew their lease, and we send out a renewal with a rent increase, and we're going to take it, let's say, from $1,000 a month to maybe $1,100 a month. HUD has the ability to look at that request for a rent increase and simply say, nope, not going to allow it. That's too steep of an increase. We're going to cap your increase at 5% or 4%, 8%, whatever they want to do. They have that ability, and we've seen that happen. So keep in mind that it's a form of rent control to where they have the ability to say, no, Mr. Landlord, we will not allow you to increase your rent beyond X percentage or X number of dollars. So that's a big deal if you're in a market where rents are escalating at a fast clip. So overall, big picture is you're putting yourself under the umbrella of the federal government if you're going to enter into a subsidized housing arrangement. It's not a bad thing in some cases, but just beware that you're putting yourself under their thumb. There are going to be restrictions. There are going to be things they're looking for. But our view is if your rental market's hot, don't bother with the housing. It just creates more loopholes, more hoops you have to jump through. But if your market's slow, if you're having trouble renting your properties or you're in a slowing market, then this may be a good opportunity to bring in individuals who are subsidized, who are going to stay a long time. Not a right or wrong, but just make sure you know these things so you can also explain to your owners and your clients the benefits, the pros, and the cons of working with HUD subsidized tenants.